Honestly, I need to start writing down where I see all your questions, but someone asked me to do a video about Margaret Pole. So here we are. Who is Margaret Pole? Margaret was born to George, Duke of Clarence, who was Edward IV's brother. Her father and, of course, Edward IV were of the Plantagenet bloodline, and she was born into the House of York during the War of the Roses. She only had one surviving sibling, which was Edward Plantagenet, also known as Teddy. And for the first 12 years of her life was pretty good. She was living under the reign of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Then, of course, entered Henry Tudor, the Tudor dynasty took over, and the remaining members of the House of York were systematically dealt with either through marriage, imprisonment, and eventually execution. Margaret's brother Teddy, who was the next male Yorkist claimant to the throne, he was imprisoned and spent the rest of his days in the Tower of London and later was executed in 1499. And Henry VII arranged for Margaret to be married off into the Lancastrian bloodline, so that she could be controlled and that any children born by her would be of the Lancastrian family. And so she was married to Sir Richard Pole, whose mother was the half-sister of Henry VII's own mother, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret and Richard went on to have 5 surviving children: Henry, Arthur, Ursula, Reginald, and Geoffrey. Margaret's husband then died in 1504 and she was left widowed, and her income was therefore severely reduced, which led to her having to send her son Reginald to live in the church, which of course led him to become Cardinal Pole and later Archbishop of Canterbury. And her leaving her at the church and all that is actually touched upon in the TV show The Spanish Princess, so that was great. When Henry VIII then became king in 1509, Margaret's circumstances improved and she was sent to attend Catherine of Aragon, the new queen. In 1512, she was granted the title of Countess of Salisbury in her own right, restoring her to a title that was previously held by her family. And this restoration brought a good income for Margaret Pole. It gave her lands and estates, and it led to her becoming one of the wealthiest women in the country. In the 1520s and 30s, Margaret's relationship with the crown became strained because of Margaret's support of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary during the Great Matter with Anne Boleyn, as well as her son's relationship with the Duke of Buckingham, who of course was executed simply due to his Plantagenet bloodline. After Henry VIII broke from Rome and created the Church of England, her son Reginald Pole spoke out against royal supremacy, which was a treasonable offence. But because Reginald was safely away in Italy, his family was sadly the ones to take the blame. Her other son, Geoffrey Pole, was arrested and Margaret was kept in custody, and she was later transferred to the Tower of London. But even though she was in the Tower of London, she was well taken care of and even had new clothes made by Queen Catherine Howard's tailor in 1541. But sadly, in May of 1541, Margaret Pole was horribly executed. There are stories that say that the executioner ran around chasing Margaret with an axe. This is not true. It is highly exaggerated, although it was a very nasty execution nonetheless. Though there was no chasing, the axeman was inexperienced and Margaret's Pole execution was botched. And according to the calendar of state papers, he was a wretched and blundering youth who literally hacked her head and shoulders into pieces in the most pitiful manner. And she was laid to rest in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London.